Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started shortly. We have our planned presentation on technology, innovation, and partnerships at the National Science Foundation. My name is Rachel Coker, and I'll be your moderator for this session. I'd like to encourage you for now to mute your audio, send your cats on their way, and turn off your camera unless you're one of the speakers for the time being. And we do anticipate that after the presentation, there'll be substantial time for Q&A. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to our speaker, you can submit it through the chat box directly to me or send it to everyone, whatever you prefer. If you have any technical questions or you're running into an audio issue and you want to check and see if it's just you or everybody, you can also find me directly in the chat for things like that. Again, my name is Rachel Coker. And I'm listed in the participant panel as moderator with as the beginning of my name to make it easier for you to find me. We would love, if it's possible, for you to use your real name as your Zoom name for today so that the folks who are with us can get an idea of who's joined the call. Mira, I'll turn things over to you unless there's any other housekeeping you'd like me to take care of. I will note that we are recording today's presentation and that we do anticipate posting it after the fact. So just please be advised of that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Dr. Gyanchandani, are we ready to start?
Sure, happy to. Let me put up my slides and then.
All right, let me just give a quick introduction. Perfect. So good afternoon. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Watson Distinguished Colloquium Seminar, co-hosted by the Thomas J. Watson College of Engineering and Applied Science and the Division of Research at Binghamton University. It is my very distinct honor and privilege to welcome and introduce our speaker today, Dr. Ervin Gyanchandani, Inaugural Assistant Director for Technology, Innovation and Partnerships, or TIP, at the U.S. National Science Foundation. Dr. Gyanchandani has been with NSF since 2012, and during this time has served in a number of key roles, including Deputy Assistant Director for the Directorate of Computer and Information Science and Engineering, or SAIS, as many of you would know it, for over 6 years, and also as its Acting Assistant Director twice. In this role, he managed the Directorate's $1 billion annual budget, led its strategic and human capital planning, and oversaw the Directorate's day-to-day operations comprising of a team of over 130 members. During his time at NSF, Dr. Gyanchandani has led the development and launch of several new NSF initiatives, including the Smart and Connected Communities Program, Civic Innovation Challenge, Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research, and the National AI Research Institutes, all high-profile programs, as many of you know. Most recently, he served as Senior Advisor for Translation, Innovation, and Partnership, developing plans for the new TIP Directorate in collaboration with colleagues from across NSF, other government agencies, industry, and academia. Before joining NSF in 2012, Dr. Gyanchandani was the inaugural Director of the Computing Community Consortium, where he led the research community's efforts in identifying and pursuing several bold, high-impact research directions, including health information technology and sustainable computing. Ervin holds a bachelor's degree in computer science and master's and doctoral degrees in biomedical engineering, all from the University of Virginia. An accomplished researcher, he is known for his contributions to the field of computational systems biology, where he has published extensively. In 2021, Ervin received the Distinguished Presidential Rank Award given to members of the federal government's Senior Executive Service for sustained extraordinary accomplishments. In 2018, he was awarded the Outstanding Young Engineer Graduate Award from the University of Virginia. Dr. Gyanchandani, we are very glad to have you with us today, and we look forward to learning more about your vision and plans for the exciting new TIP initiative at NSF. At this time, I would also like to welcome the many colleagues and friends who have joined us today, our state and local government representatives, our partners from industry, colleagues from federal agencies, labs, and affiliated organizations, many of our academic research and education partners, my Binghamton University colleagues, and friends from across the SUNY system. A couple of more things before we begin. As Rachel just said, We request you to submit any questions you may have anytime during the presentation using the chat function. And Rachel would manage the chat session and she will be relaying your questions to Dr. Gyanchandani at the end of the presentation. You may also unmute yourself and ask your questions live if you choose to do so at that time. We will try to get to as many questions as we can today. And again, like Rachel said, we will be recording today's session, and everyone who's registered will receive an email with the link to the presentation in a few days. With that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Dr. Gyanchandani.
So Mira, thank you so very much for that really kind introduction, and good afternoon to you. I think most folks are on the East Coast time zone for this group, but just in case, good morning if you're not. It's great to be with all of you today. I am so sorry I can't be there in person up in Binghamton, New York today, but I do appreciate that you're willing to let me do this virtually. And I'm really delighted to be able to spend some time with you today to talk about our plans for this new Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or TIP as we call it, at the National Science Foundation. So what I'm going to do over the course of the next hour or so is first walk you through a little bit of the motivation, the inspiration that led us to establishing a new directorate just over a month and a half ago now. And then also a bit about the mission and the vision for this directorate. And then I'll spend some time talking about some of the key functions, 3 key functional aspects associated with the directorate, and then also some exemplar programs, including the NSF Regional Innovation Engines program that we launched just about a couple of weeks ago now, and we're really excited about and really looking forward to talking about as well. And so I hope you get a sense through this of again, why a new directorate, what our mission space is, and how we hope to achieve that mission through various programs. I'm going to start first with a little bit of a reminder about the National Science Foundation. I think many of you know this, but I know that the audience for today's talk spans the university as well as surrounding industry partners, state and local governments, and so forth. So just a reminder about the mission. And I think this is also important because it puts TIP, this new directorate, in context, because what we're trying to do, we think, is very directly aligned with the mission space of NSF. So we've been around for 72 years, and since our establishment in 1950 by Congress as an agency within the federal government, our aspiration has been to promote the progress of science, to advance the nation's health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. And we have done that over the course of those 70 plus years by supporting research and education activities in nearly every discipline of science and engineering, from biology to all facets of engineering, to math and physical sciences, chemistry, to computer science, where I spent quite a bit of time in my time here at NSF, the geosciences, social behavioral economic sciences, and so forth. Pretty much the only area that we don't touch is medical research, since that tends to be the purview of our colleagues up the street in Bethesda at the National Institutes of Health, though we do collaborate with NIH as we collaborate with other agencies, and I'll talk more about that over the course of this presentation as well. One last point I'll make is that we are very interested in international partnerships with colleagues abroad, particularly in like-minded countries, so that we can both benefit from and also help support efforts in terms of democracy enhancing science and technology all around the globe. So how does that translate, right? So we talk about research and supporting research and education across all disciplines of science and engineering. Well, in the current fiscal year, FY22, which runs through the end of September, our budget for the foundation is about $8.8 billion. 2 numbers on this chart, maybe 3 numbers on this chart that I'll highlight, 2 of which we're especially proud of. One is that about 93% of all of the investment that Congress appropriates to the foundation goes out the door in the form of grants, cooperative agreements, contracts, other arrangements to help support research and education and related activities. So we don't do research in-house at NSF, unlike our colleagues at NIH. We're in the business of trying to support the frontiers of science and engineering by supporting the great work that you all do. The other number is the 318,000 people whom we support at any given time. That's 318,000 faculty, students, researchers at all levels, K through 12, undergrad, graduate, postdocs, and so forth, trying to advance the frontiers of science and engineering. And the third number that I'll highlight is $181 million. So in the most recently completed fiscal year, 2021, NSF invested $181 million to seed public and private partnerships, working together with private industry, nonprofits, and foundations, and so forth. You'll hear me talking about that as sort of a priority for the foundation. And that $181 million is largely matched by contributions, funding, and in-kind contributions by partners in those various other sectors as well. And one last sort of number slide to level set, just to give you a sense of sort of the level of investment by NSF and how we touch the academic community historically. So across all of science and engineering, the basic research that's taking place in the labs at Binghamton and the universities all across the country, the basic research in those fields that's funded by the federal government, about a quarter of that flows through NSF. But you can see that the level of investment varies. And so in certain fields of engineering, in biology, in the social sciences, and mathematics, and computer science, could be as much as or more than 3/4 of all federal investment in those fields in basic research in academia comes through the National Science Foundation. So as our budget grows or doesn't, that has a significant impact with respect to the correspondence on the academic enterprise. So with that as sort of context for the foundation, I wanted to just add a little bit more sort of perspective. About a couple of years ago now, NSF, our new director to the foundation at the time, Sethuraman Panchanathan, arrived from Arizona State University and put forward sort of 3 key areas of emphasis for the foundation as we look to the future. Advancing science and technology to address the nation's needs, to address our societal and economic challenges, enabling opportunity everywhere, and global leadership and competitiveness. And I'm going to talk about each one of these in turn over the next few slides, again, just for context setting. But each one of these is critically important, not just to the foundation as a whole, but critically important to the mission and the vision of the TIP directorate within the foundation as well. So let me first start with advancing science and tech to address national needs. When we talk about that, that really spans, you see on this slide, sort of a double helix, if you will, sort of the double helix of DNA. Well, the double helix DNA for the National Science Foundation, in our view, is this melding of curiosity-driven, discovery-based explorations, as well as use-inspired, solutions-focused innovations too. And we support research and innovation activities across that entire spectrum, and we have for nearly 72 years of our existence. So for example, on the curiosity-driven side, just last Thursday, you probably saw it in the news, you probably saw it in the newspapers and on TV, NSF was out front with support for the discovery of the Milky Way's black hole, the black hole in our galaxy, validating Einstein's theory of relativity. A lot of technology that underpinned that, but at the end of the day, this was a discovery that we hope that's rooted in the curiosity of how our world works, that we helped fund over the course of many years of investments, many decades of investments, really, on the Event Horizon Telescope and in partnership with colleagues abroad as well. And on the other end of the spectrum, when COVID-19 emerged as a pandemic in its form here in the US and abroad, we at NSF immediately went to work and ended up funding more than $200 million of projects, rapid response projects that helped us to better understand the virus, the disease, the spread of the disease, and so forth. So very much nearer term impacts, very much solutions focused. As a matter of fact, NSF funding was critical at the time to being able to model the protein, the spike protein on the virus that ultimately has such an instrumental role in being able to infect humans and cause the kind of virulent disease that we have seen. And so this is just an illustration of sort of this spectrum from foundational to much more use-inspired research that we have long supported as we advance the frontiers of science and technology. In terms of enabling opportunity everywhere, so that's the second thrust of those 3 sort of pillars, if you will. This chart is meant to really illustrate the diversity of the science and engineering workforce as it stood in 2021, and then the numbers of additional people whom we would need to support in the science and engineering workforce, be it women, be it Hispanic or Latino, Black or African American or American Indian or Alaskan Native populations, the numbers of additional folks whom we would have to support in order to reflect by the year 2030 the population diversity that would exist across the United States. So clearly a tremendous amount of work that we have to do. And in that regard, NSF has significant investments and efforts afoot to really develop a broadening participation framework that takes into account increasing the knowledge base about how we can contribute to broadening participation, thinking about the specific interventions or capacity building steps that we can take at all different institution types to enhance that broadening participation, teaching and learning. What are the tools and infrastructure that we need, and how do we partner with stakeholders across the spectrum, across the science and engineering communities to really enable that broadening participation that we need to see? At the end of the day, and you'll hear me talk about this more in the TIP directorate construct, it is so critical that we really try to ensure that we have the participation of everyone, everywhere across this country who has or could have an interest in potentially engaging in STEM. And as a matter of fact, one of our newest initiatives that we've announced as part of the President's budget request for FY 2023 is something that we're calling GrantEd. How do we help provide resources to diverse institution types, particularly those institutions that maybe don't have the capacity for those resources today? How do we provide those resources so that they can further expand their research and education portfolios? And so, for example, there are many institutions that have very small sponsored research offices, if at all, very small tech transfer offices, if at all. I had a conversation this morning where I learned about the growth of Binghamton's tech transfer activities just over the course of the last decade and more. And so how do we at NSF provide institutions with the resourcing to be able to grow everything from sponsored research to tech transfer and everything in between, those key support activities that are so instrumental for allowing for participation in research and education activities? And then the third pillar around global competitiveness. And when we talk about global competitiveness here, it's not strictly about the US being a leader by itself, but the US working collaboratively with like-minded countries to really share and reaffirm democratic values when it comes to the science and the engineering and the societal impacts of that science and engineering that we look to support. And so this slide is just trying to illustrate one example in the case of artificial intelligence, AI, where the investments that NSF has made dating back over 5, 6, 7 decades, all the way to the 1970s, in machine learning and natural language processing and Bayesian networks, it's those investments that are paying dividends all these years later today in the form of the AI revolution that we're seeing, whether it be machine learning classifiers that have led us to the computer vision systems that we need for self-driving cars, or the Bayesian networks that afford a better understanding of traffic prediction and routing, or facial expressions, and trying to get a sense of facial expressions through the social, behavioral, and economic sciences that we support that allow us to be able to ensure that we can leverage facial expressions and facial techniques in a safe and secure and privacy-preserving and affirming and robust manner as we look to the future. But our investments in AI, we're not just looking back, we're also looking forward. And that's why a couple of years ago, we launched the National AI Research Institutes program. You heard Mira mention that at the outset here. Our goal with this program has been to fund national hubs of excellence, if you will, in AI, supporting the full spectrum from foundational to use-inspired research, really bringing together the multiple disciplinary perspectives that one needs when it comes to AI, everything from the social and behavioral and economic sciences to computer science to engineering to systems and beyond. How do we bring those different sets of perspectives together? How do we bring multiple sectors together to be able to support the frontiers of artificial intelligence and really catapult the next slide that we show 50 years from now, if you will, like the previous slide, the slide that we would show 50 years from now to illustrate the breadth and depth of impact of the AI innovation that we're trying to fuel today for tomorrow's impacts on society. Each of these AI institutes is funded at the level of $20 million over 5 years, so a significant investment from the foundation. And you can see how we have states color-coded here to distinguish which ones received 2020 awards, and then on top of that, which ones received 2021 awards. So some of the darker blue states were also 2020 awards recipients, but we've kind of superimposed the 21 awards on top of that. I think an important point about the AI Institutes that I would love to communicate is not just that we're looking to partner at the NSF level with other stakeholders to help fund the AI Institutes program. So for instance, over the years, we've now worked with Department of Homeland Security, Department of Transportation, Department of Agriculture. USDA in particular has been a terrific partner, wholly funding 4 of these AI Institutes over the last few years. We've also worked with the private sector. Again, these partnerships, these direct partnerships between NSF and other stakeholders help us to catalyze research directions and help to fund institutes. We've funded a whole institute on top of what we would have been able to fund by ourselves as a result of these partnerships. But there's also the catalyzed partnerships, the partnerships that grow out of the collaborations that result when proposers come together for an AI Institutes project. So for example, in 2020, we funded a project, the Institute for Research on Trustworthy AI in Weather, Climate, Coastal Oceanography, led by the University of Oklahoma. But you can see all of the institutions that were involved across the different states coded in orange here. And in addition to the university partners, the universities worked collaboratively with other federal agencies to create their own partnerships with NOAA and the Navy to uptake some of the research results from the program. From the project, also working with industry collaborators as well, Google, IBM, NVIDIA, Disaster Technologies, and others, and working with state and local agencies, including in New York, to really drive forward progress and allow for the translation of some of the research that's coming out of the AI Institute into practice as well. And so I put this slide up here to illustrate that there are the direct partnerships that we hope to catalyze and we hope to leverage to help fund the AI Institutes program. And then there are the partnerships that the awardees go off and pursue that allow for motivating the research questions and also allow for sort of translating the research results to practice. And you'll hear me say much more about that in the context of the TIP Directorate as we move forward. So I hope that that gives you some grounding about how we're thinking about things at NSF in the context of those 3 pillars around advancing science and technology, around allowing for participation from everyone everywhere, and really thinking about how we have such an important perch as far as global competitiveness is concerned as well. So I'm going to now dive into, with that as context, why a new directorate? If you've read the press release, you already know the answer, and it's a little hard to do this in a virtual setting, but I'll just say for you all, instead of asking the question, it's been 32 years since the National Science Foundation stood up a new directorate. So we don't do this every day. It's literally a once in a generation, even more opportunity, and it's really a defining moment that we hope is responsive to the defining moment that we see in the country today as well. And that defining moment, there are 4 characteristics that we see front and center that create this moment. First is the intense global competition in other countries that are investing in key technology areas and so forth. Sorry about that. Second is sort of the bipartisan support that we are seeing in the halls of Congress and with the administration as well, really very much supportive of the research activities that NSF has, really very supportive of the work that we are trying to support through all of you and all of our universities and the broader ecosystem that is the science and engineering enterprise, and how it pays dividends for our nation's economy in the long run. And the third is around that piece of missing millions that I talked about earlier. How do we do a better job of engaging folks in all different parts of the country, not just strictly on the coasts or in the big cities, but how do we engage folks all across the country in really helping to address some of the foremost technological and societal and economic challenges that we face? And then the fourth defining moment is the changing science and engineering enterprise. So if you all take a moment and sort of take a step back and think about the science and engineering enterprise in this country over the last 5, 10, 15 years, I think you would agree that the pace of discovery in nearly every field, nearly every sector of our economy has dramatically dramatically accelerated just over the course of the last decade as a result of access to unprecedented amounts of data, as well as emerging technologies like machine learning that allow us to be able to analyze those data in real time and really generate predictive insights that can drive decision-making as well. In terms of our earlier career researchers, folks who are going into STEM today, for instance, many of them are saying, particularly on the heels of the pandemic, where we saw science help fuel vaccines, for example, many of them are saying that they're going into science and engineering because they want their work to be able to have a positive impact on society. And where is STEM talent today? STEM talent is increasingly distributed across sectors. No longer is it that we focus on PhD scientists and engineers, and many of them go off into academia and some into industry. But today we have talent at all levels: PhDs, masters, bachelors, associate's degrees, K through 12, and trying to go off into academia, industry, nonprofit, civil society, communities of practice, and so forth. So how do we create the blended teams that leverage that talent and leverage those partnerships to allow us to be able to address some of the key needs that we have today? So that's a little bit of the motivation in terms of this defining moment. And for us, we feel that we can meet this moment with a particular and intentional focus. So I've talked about how NSF supports research on the spectrum from pure basic to use-inspired basic research. If I take AI, that example from earlier, for instance, we support innovations looking at sort of the foundational underpinnings of reasoning and language processing and knowledge representation and learning and so forth, more on the pure basic research side. And we also support innovations thinking about AI in the context of agriculture, in the context of disasters, in the context of transportation. So much more use-inspired basic research. And so really our footprint is in the top half of this diagram, less so on the bottom right. In pure applied, it tends to be the purview of other mission-oriented agencies, but then also in translation and innovation. Some of you may know that NSF pioneered the Small Business Innovation Research SBIR program for the federal government back in the 1970s. We pioneered the I-Corps program back in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And so we have this sort of third axis, if you will, around translation and innovation. And we feel that in terms of the momentous challenges that we face today, an intentional focus on use-inspired basic research and translation allows us to be able to start to move the needle in some of those key areas for our country. And so that takes us to the placement of TIP. Yes, we have existing directorates and offices across the foundation. They're doing lots of collaborations among themselves today, hence the sort of honeycomb as opposed to verticals or silos. For example, our flagship cybersecurity program involves 5 of the directorates, and so 5 of the disparate communities reflected on this chart. Having said that, though, we see TIP as a new horizontal. It's a horizontal that allows us to be able to partner with all of our existing directorates and all of the fields that we support across NSF and really elevate and strengthen and scale the investments that we're making in use-inspired and translational research, which we're making to different degrees across the directorates, across the foundation, but really trying to enhance that across NSF as we look to the future. So another way of thinking about everything that I've said up until this point, and if maybe you take one slide away so far from this conversation, it's a little bit of a paradigm shift. And this is broad brushstrokes. For everything on the left-hand side, you could make an argument that there are programs at NSF that do what's on the right-hand side, or what you'll see on the right-hand side in just a second. But in terms of broad brushstrokes, a lot of what NSF has done up until now has been largely investigator-driven science and engineering. Great investigators, great ideas, great students, but primarily academic research teams that have fueled a steady stream of discoveries that have improved our quality of life all across the country and all around the globe for that matter. What we'd like to do with TIP is sort of expand that a little bit and really focus in on the users, the beneficiaries, the consumers of the research, and engage them in helping to shape and helping to even conduct the research as well, working hand in glove, side by side with researchers in academia. So this is about trying to catalyze multi-sector teams that bring academia and industry and government and civil society and communities of practice together, and really focusing in on the important societal, the important economic, the important technological problems that we face today, and having those drive the research that we're pursuing. So another way of thinking about this is trying to expand from a little bit of a more strict focus around technology and supply push, funding some great ideas and some great work that results in great new insights and technologies, and now pushing those out to the market and to society. And expanding that to think about market and demand pull, bringing the market to help shape the research, and then become excited in it to be able to accelerate its translation into society for positive impact. And so that is the motivation that led us to establish the new TIP Directorate back in the middle of March. And as we described it then, I'll describe it now as sort of the critical first step that will allow us to be able to accelerate the development of new technologies and products that improve our way of life and create new jobs and economic growth, and sustain competitiveness for the US for decades to come. It's an important first step, though, and we look forward to working with Congress on the Bipartisan Innovation Act and appropriations for NSF to really be able to deliver on the full vision for the TIP Directorate. And in fact, some of you may have seen the President's FY 2023 budget request speaks a bit to the resourcing for this directorate, calls for an increase to the foundation of close to 20% over our 2022 levels, the current fiscal year. So about $10.5 billion would be the budget level for the new for the foundation in fiscal year 2022. And as part of that, about a $900 million investment in the TIP Directorate, including investments in partnership with the other directorates in a number of key technology areas, from manufacturing to wireless to AI to biotech to microelectronics to quantum information science, and other areas not reflected on this slide, like advanced materials, for example. I think an important part that I want to highlight here is when you think about the budget for NSF and the budget for TIP. So the overall NSF budget at the President's budget request level grows by about $1.7 billion relative to where we are today. And of that $1.7 billion, the budget for TIP includes growth of about $500 million. You'll see that we're moving some existing programs within the foundation to the directorate. And then on top of that is an additional $500 million in new funding. So that's $500 million out of $1.7 billion. And so this is very much designed to be a balanced approach so that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. We're fueling that curiosity-driven, discovery-oriented research as much as we're growing investments too in the realm of use-inspired and solution-oriented, solution-focused research as well. So hopefully that gives you some context in terms of the inspiration for this directorate and the mission space for this directorate as well. I'm going to dive in now into sort of the functional attributes for the directorate. So mission and vision translating to function. And then next I'll talk about the form, the actual programmatics, as form follows function. So for us, as we think about technology and innovation and partnerships, we think about three key areas of emphasis. One is partnerships. I've talked about that already. I'm going to keep hitting on that point because to us, it's the partnerships that really serve as a foundation for being able to deliver on this vision. An example of that actually is a collaboration that we just announced with Intel a few months ago at the start of this year, a partnership with them as they were announcing a $20 billion investment in the state of Ohio, building upon investments that they had in Arizona as well to stand up new chip making facilities for the next generation of semiconductor chips to help onshore chip production back in the US. As part of that, NSF and Intel entered into a $100 million agreement over the course of the next several years to specifically support investments in universities and community colleges all across the country to help advance semiconductor design and manufacturing research and education. Key focus for us is on those community colleges and minority serving institutions to try to grow the workforce base, but also to support research activities as well that will fuel the next generation of semiconductor design and manufacturing here in the US. So this is an example of private sector and NSF coming together, focusing on a specific problem space, helping to define that problem space jointly, and then helping to co-fund research and education projects as we look to the future, really about leveraging dollars and expertise and other kinds of resources as well. So partnerships are a foundation. One level above that, if you will, are the innovation and technology ecosystems that we hope to fuel all across the country with those partnerships as a basis set. And here you'll see some existing programs across NSF, like the Convergence Accelerator, highlighted in sort of a darker shade of blue, that are being repositioned into TIP. So the Convergence Accelerator in particular over the course of the last several years has invested in a number of different tracks. So we try to fund project teams, a number of project teams with small level of investment to kickstart within each track. And then we do a down select to a smaller number of larger size projects that we fund for phase 2 of a Convergence Accelerator track. But you can see that the CA over the course of the last several years has supported projects, everything from AI and open knowledge networks to AI and the future of work, to new quantum technology platforms, to thinking about the networked blue economy, trust and authenticity in communication systems, and so forth. Really trying to focus in on use-inspired research and the translation of some of that research to practice by cultivating partnerships that bring together key stakeholders in each of these areas. So there are existing programs like the Convergence Accelerator that reposition into this directorate. And then there are a set in the teal coloring, if you will, of new investments that we have planned depending upon the budget levels for the directorate. And those include investments in emerging technologies as well as in regional scale innovation all across the country. I'll talk more about that. Also in experiential and entrepreneurial learning. How do we provide students with opportunities that allow them to have the practical experiences in industry, in nonprofits, in state and local governments, the practical experiences that complement what they're learning in the classroom setting so that they can be better positioned for jobs into the future and even have pathways into those jobs by virtue of those internships and externships and other types of experiential and entrepreneurial opportunities that they have. So sort of that middle tranche is innovation and technology ecosystems. And then the final one layer above that, is technology translation. So as we see new science and technology emerging from these ecosystems, how do we help accelerate the translation of that work into practice? And that could be using our existing lab to market platforms. So we provide, as you all know, experiential opportunities for, or entrepreneurship education opportunities, I should say, through the I-Corps program to assess that customer market fitness. We provide opportunities for licensing to companies of technology as you start to harden and mature it through the Partnerships for Innovation program. And we provide opportunities for thinking through de-risking of deep technology ventures through the SBIR, or Small Business Technology Transfer, STTR program as well. So that's a lab to market platform that we have. But are there innovative pathways that we can also imagine that go beyond that? In some fields, for instance, in the wireless space, we've seen how open source ecosystems can offer a competitive advantage to closed box approaches that other countries might be pursuing. And so what are those additional pathways to technological translational impact that we want to pursue through TIP as well? So these are the three sort of key functional attributes that we see: partnerships, innovation and tech ecosystems, and technology translation. I'm now going to give you an illustration of a couple of key program highlights that hopefully will make this real, make this very tangible. So the first is around regional innovation. And for us there, a flagship effort that we launched a couple of weeks ago is the NSF Regional Innovation Engines, or NSF Engines program. So our goal with the NSF Engines program really is to cultivate new innovation ecosystems at the scale of regions all across the country. And we have several purposes for doing this. One is to be able to address some of the key scientific and technological challenges that we have, while also addressing societal and economic challenges as well. And the other is thinking about how we balance technical and geographic innovation. So if you look at the image on the bottom here, you see sort of bidirectionality between some exemplar societal economic challenges like climate change and equity, equitable access to healthcare and education, for instance, critical and resilient infrastructure. You could imagine other forms of societal economic challenges in those clouds in the top half of this chart. And then a number of key sort of technology areas: AI, manufacturing, advanced materials, wireless, and so forth on the bottom half of this chart. And it's that balancing between the two. So as we have new innovations in materials, for example, that can help drive new approaches when we think about the climate change and climate resilience problem. And as we think about climate change, that can help surface use cases that motivate new work in the material synthesis space. And so really that balance is core to us in terms of how we think about these engines. And then if I just take climate for a second, I think you all would agree that that manifests itself in different ways depending upon the geography of the country. So on the West Coast and in the Southwest, we're talking about droughts and wildfires. Here in the East and the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, just look at the severe weather that's forecast for later today, pushing through, creating flooding and other kinds of potential significant challenges. And so how do we balance both the technical innovation and the geographic innovation? And that might mean having multiple engines in different parts of the country working on similar types of problems, but then coming together so that the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts. Our goal with the NSF engines is to take an intentionally different approach. It's different in a number of ways in terms of the scale of investment and the duration of the investment. So we're talking about 10 years worth of investment to the tune of about $160 million potentially. We're talking about the engagement of a broad and diverse set of stakeholders, those users being intentionally engaged and helping to contribute to iterative co-design and co-creation. So surfacing problems, conducting research, piloting solutions, learning from those, and then repeating that process all over again. It's going to require pulling together the engine teams themselves almost as a cohort and providing them with sort of the training that it takes to creating an innovation ecosystem, evaluating the overall approach, evaluating the individual projects. It's going to involve milestones for success over time, some of which will come from the teams and some of which will come from, some of which will come from NSF as a whole. And then I think maybe the most important factor here is really thinking about a set of success expectations that are different from a typical NSF project. So a real emphasis around regional scale development, for example, contributing to economic growth and job creation. Thinking about the science and the technology that's resulting and the training in the form of new practitioners, new entrepreneurs, new technicians, a whole set of folks who are going to be trained as a result of this innovation engine that's at work. So going beyond sort of the typical training of PhDs to think about all of those different levels. And I think ultimately there's a little bit of sort of culture change here. Yes, we're interested in publications and conference proceedings. Someone asked me a couple of weeks ago, if you end up with an engine that has no publications and conference proceedings, is that success? And that might be a little bit hard given the fact that we're starting from a place of use-inspired research. But we want to go beyond that to think about the new patents, the new startups, the new small businesses, the new open source ecosystems, the new technologies that are resulting, the new impacts that are resulting, and the new education and training that's resulting as well as we move forward. So another way of thinking about this in terms of engines and expanding that innovation throughout the US. So I could have identified any number of examples on this chart. I've picked 4 that are not strictly on the coasts, for instance, just to try to provide a little bit of diversity here. So one is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I think many of you are pretty familiar with the robotics industry that's set up shop around the universities there with new startups and small businesses. Another is Nashville, Tennessee, and the medical device industry that we see in Nashville that's come together around Vanderbilt and the hospital there. Chattanooga, Tennessee is a story around deploying high-speed fiber to that community by virtue of upgrading the power grid in that community. And that high-speed fiber has catapulted a gigabit innovation revolution in and around that community and region. And then Huntsville, Alabama, in terms of trying to be able to afford the Air Force Base there through the aerospace and defense industry that's congregated around Huntsville. And so those are 4-point examples. And what we hope to be able to see with the NSF Engines program is really expanding that geography of innovation throughout the US, where we give ourselves the opportunity to be able to catalyze that sort of innovation ecosystem in every part of the country and really engage the diverse set of stakeholders from all across the country as well. So what constitutes an engine? You know, another way of thinking about this is to say that the engine is really that framework, recognizing that every innovation ecosystem is a little bit different in terms of what makes it successful, how it comes together. But the NSF investment, the NSF engine provides that framework that brings together industry, institutions of higher education, government, nonprofits, community organizations, allows a focus on a topic area of regional relevance, and that really pertains to national and societal significance as well. And then over time grows to the point that the region itself is benefiting such from that engine that it is reinvesting into the engine, and 10 years out no longer needs or is contingent upon NSF investment for long-term success. So we've launched this program just within the last couple of weeks. We are actually have a webinar scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. I encourage you all, you can still sign up. I encourage you all to join that webinar. And then we're doing a series of regional roadshows over the course of the next several weeks, about the next month or so. One point that I want to stress here, please don't take any significance to how the states have been grouped together as part of these regions. We just had to find some way to divide up the nation's geography so that we could get to a reasonable sized roadshow, and also the ability to be able to do state-by-state breakout sessions. But hopefully this will give you additional opportunity to engage with the team that's developing these engines and helping to support this program as we look to the future as well. And then, of course, as I think many of you are aware, the deadlines for the concept outlines for both a type 1, the development grant for those innovation ecosystems that are just getting started, just getting together, as well as for type 2 awards, the ones that have sort of a nexus that's come together and are better positioned to be able to start down the path of regional innovation engine. Both of those concept outlines are due June 30th. And then we've announced deadlines for the type 1s, and we'll be announcing deadlines for type 2s in the down the road as well. One final point about the Innovation Engines program that I want to highlight. Often when I present this, folks ask, well, this is going to require funding, and absolutely it's going to require funding to be able to deliver on the engine's vision. But I think an important point that sometimes comes up as well is the notion of, well, there's the Innovation and Competition Act in the Senate, and there's the America Competes Act in the House. And we've heard in the media that there are some differences between those two bills, and there absolutely are. But there are also some similarities, and there's a particular similarity when it comes to the NSF Regional Innovation Engines program. So the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act authorizes NSF to establish a program. They call it the University Technology Centers, UTCs, that would support multidisciplinary research in a range of key technology focus areas that would bring together partners from across different sectors, and that would really help to grow entrepreneurial and educational capacity within the region that's served by that University Tech Center. So that's one definition of what this might look like, University Tech Centers. Another is Technology Research Institutes in America Competes. So every single one of these has a different name. Mostly we just want to confuse everybody, but the Technology Research Institutes would also conduct fundamental research to advance innovation in a key technology area, would help solve societal challenges, would do so in partnership with multiple sectors, and would grow the research experiences in government and industry for our students. And so really there's a lot of similarity between these two pieces of legislation that are now being conferenced, and a lot of alignment between those and how we've been designing and thinking about the Regional Innovation Engines program as well. So hopefully that gives you a sense for that middle tranche around regional innovation and emerging tech, and also some of the experiential opportunities through an engine that we hope to enable. I'm going to spend the last little part here talking about technology translation. So we, in a typical year at the National Science Foundation, will support anywhere between 8,000 and 11,000 new research projects. And as those research projects progress, they get to a point where researchers are now starting to think about some of the science and technology that's emerging, and how do I start to transition that to practice? How do I take those first steps of maturing or hardening some of my outputs? And some of our programs offer something called TTP, Transition to Practice, to be able to do just that. But as you get a little bit further, you start to think about, where do I want to take that work? Should it end up as a new product in the marketplace? Should it be a startup or small business? Is that the lineage that I want to follow? And in that context, as I described earlier, we have these programs, PFI, I-Corps, and SBIR-STTR, that try to help folks get across that sort of spectrum from that research project all the way into sort of new product startups and markets. But there are other potential translational impacts as well. Open source ecosystems offer a competitive advantage in some fields. And we just a few months ago rolled out a new program, Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems, or POES. The deadline for that was just last week. Our goal with this is to provide researchers and students with the resourcing and the training from those who have done this before in case study form to be able to get from a research output to an open source ecosystem that can continue to fuel innovation and continue to fuel impact as well. And then there are other forms of translational impact. The adoption of research results by government agencies in terms of their ability to conduct their missions. Teeing up research results, hardening and maturing them so that they can help to inform public policymaking. It's not NSF's role to do that policymaking, but it can be our role to help support you all to tee up that research in ecology or the environment to help inform the EPA, or in spectrum to help inform the FCC and the NTIA and so forth. We spend a lot of money every year on education research. How do we translate some of that into adaptations that can scale at K through 12 levels or in community colleges or in institutions of higher education as we look to the future? So a real emphasis here on trying to build out some of these TBDs as we think about delivering from the bench to broader societal benefits. And so hopefully this gives you a flavor for how we think about the TIP Directorate as a whole, partnerships leading to these ecosystems, leading to our ability to have new science and technology that can be translated. And maybe one of the most important pieces of this that I have talked about in several ways, but I'm just going to close by emphasizing this, is this notion of diversity and equity and inclusivity and accessibility. As we've thought about the Engines program, for instance, as we think about all of the new investments that might come out of the TIP Directorate, one thing that's really critical for us is how do we engage diverse institution types, like some of those that are seen on this slide, and diverse individuals as well, so that we can truly harness that geography of innovation. This is called designing in DEIA because oftentimes, I come from computer science, as some of you know, and from the cybersecurity world, where for many, many years we were designing new systems and then thinking about how to secure those systems. And I think there was a recognition a little over a decade ago about the importance of designing in security from the get-go so that we don't have some of the challenges that we've seen over the years in the cybersecurity realm. Same thing's true here by analogy. How do we design a program that can speak to diverse institution types, diverse individuals and populations as well, and engage them as appropriate in the conduct of the work that we're hoping to enable. And so through these listening sessions that we've run over the course of the last several months in the build up to the rollout of the Engines program, a couple of weeks ago, we've tried to take away some key bits of information about how to do this more effectively. Everything from the challenges to building strong partnerships to thinking about capacity building at small institutions. I talked about the granted effort for NSF, for instance, thinking about policy issues that NSF has. So we, for example, restrict funding to faculty to 2 months of faculty time in a given year. Well, to be able to run one of these engines, particularly depending on the institution that we're talking about, it's going to require full-time engagement, and it's going to require an ability to be able to buy out of some of the teaching and coursework responsibilities to be able to focus in on the engine at the meta level and the success of the engine. The value of mentoring. How do we engage, for instance, institutions that might not be within the region of service, not necessarily as leads, but to help, maybe they come from a vibrant innovation ecosystem, they have necessary sort of supply chain background and perspectives that can be brought to bear. How do we engage those in a mentoring role to be able to help a particular institution trying to go about and set up a new regional innovation engine, for instance? And then also challenges associated with geographic isolation, depending upon the institution and where one might be located, might be very disconnected from the circumstance that you see in an urban environment where you have many schools that are pretty co-located or pretty proximal to one another. So how do you overcome that as well? So we're spending a lot of time thinking about this as we think about the design and the structure of our programs. I think you'll hear my program officers say more about that at the webinar about the engines, for instance, when we have that tomorrow as well. So just a couple of slides to wrap up. So we were really thrilled to be able to launch the TIP Directorate and get it off the ground in March of 2022. Again, we don't do this every day. So it's been a trial by fire for many of us as we've done this over the course of the last 20 months or so, but really excited to be able to do that. You've seen how there are a number of programs that we're repositioning, like SBIR, I-Core, PFI, the Convergence Accelerator, and you've now also seen how we've been planning new investments and are delighted to roll out things like the Engines program. And one thing I'll say is we are looking for great talent to come work at NSF too. So when I do these talks, it's partly because we want you to write great proposals to NSF. It's also partly because if you are interested in coming to work at NSF, I have to staff a whole directorate eventually. We have some great talent that's moving in from other parts of the foundation associated with some of those existing programs, but particularly those who might have that emphasis or that background and experience around technology translation, startups, small businesses, thinking about innovation ecosystems and entrepreneurship. Please feel free to reach out because we are very much interested in your perspectives and trying to get those perspectives into the foundation as well. And so lastly, I will close with this slide. And I know it says lab to market at the bottom, but I really think it could say lab to society more generally, because that's how we've been thinking about translational impacts within TIP. And you all have seen, I think many of you, a version of this slide with the valley of death, so-called, in the center. So a lot of federal investment that drives the foundational research that we support on the left-hand side. A lot of private sector investment that drives product development and commercialization activities. And it's the stuff in between that really falls through the cracks. And what we hope to do with TIP, I'm not going to draw a bridge necessarily, as is often done here, but we really see that valley of death for TIP as a ramp of opportunity. We see it as an opportunity for us to really be able to shape and orchestrate new investments that allow us to facilitate everything from use-inspired research to translational research and ultimately to the impact of the work that we're trying to support all across the National Science Foundation. So with that, I'll pause. I hope this has been helpful and along the lines of what you were expecting or hoping for. And I welcome questions for, I guess, the balance of the time that we have.
Thank you so much. And we do indeed have a number of questions, like several dozen. So I'm going to try to fire these at you in a way that makes sense. Folks, if you're listening, you're still welcome to post questions in the chat, and I'll continue to try to match them up and put them in an order that makes some sense for our speaker. I want to start with a question for you that looks, at a broad perspective about TIP. And because it seems to be such a significant shift away from the way that NSF traditionally has funded research, do you feel that the new directorate calls for some fundamental shifts in how PIs are thinking about and approaching these opportunities? Maybe you could speak to the kinds of changes you think are going to be needed on the part of PIs and from institutions.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Rachel. That's a great question. So a couple of things that I would say. So first of all, I want to come back to a point that I made at the outset, which is that I hope if you take a couple of things away from this talk, one thing that I hope you will take is that we continue to support curiosity-driven, discovery-oriented research across the foundation through the existing directorates prior to the establishment of TIP. So let's make sure we keep our fingers on that and keep our pulse on that and not lose sight of that in the course of what we're trying to do here. Having said that, to your point, to the point of the person who asked this question, I do think that as folks think about the investments that we make through TIP, this emphasis on trying to think through co-design and co-creation, trying to partner with stakeholders across different sectors to help motivate and inspire the research, trying to think about the outputs that we're going to have. So those outputs are not strictly, we're not excluding those as outputs, but they're not strictly publications and conference proceedings, but thinking about the broader sort of impacts of the work that we're trying to support in terms of new technologies that are created and piloted and scaled in terms of new educational and workforce growth that we're hoping to see at all levels. I do think that that requires sort of a different way of thinking to some degree. We've done it in some of our existing programs. I think the AI Institutes, our Civic Innovation Challenge and Smart and Connected Communities programs are sort of exemplars, precursors, if you will, to what we're talking about here. But I do think that that requires a little bit of a phase shift. And as you think about that phase shift, maybe thinking through a little bit about the implications of that on a university environment with respect to what faculty are focused on and what students are being trained on.
We have a great question in the chat from Siva, who asks about how NSF and TIP in particular sees community colleges becoming part of the innovation ecosystem, particularly in areas such as smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0 workforce development. Could you speak about that?
Yeah, so I'm so glad that that question was asked. So I have a couple of thoughts on that. So first of all, I would say that community colleges, I said this in a session this morning, community colleges, I think many of us at NSF view are sort of a vastly untapped treasure trove in our country. So we have tremendous talent at community colleges, oftentimes folks who are working days and schooling nights and weekends, but not necessarily, but folks who are really interested in reskilling and upskilling, folks who are really interested in potentially advancing their skill set so that they can contribute in new and emerging technology areas for the betterment of society. And so I think that part of our goal really is to think about ways in which we can draw in community colleges into the work that we're supporting through the Engines program, in other ways too, and I'll talk about that in a second, so that we can really create pathways for students to get not just that associate's degree, but maybe use that as a launching pad to be able to pursue a 4-year degree at a university, or go even from there into grad school, or progress into private industry. In fact, one of the things that we've been thinking about, tied with the Engines, but also independent of the Engines to some respects, is there an opportunity for us to sort of bring together industry and state and local actors and NSF with community colleges to sort of create a holistic approach to how we're thinking about the training and how we're thinking about the experiential opportunities, internships, externships that we're providing students who are enrolled at community colleges, so that they can progress through various pathways into jobs or into 4-year universities. So I think that at the end of the day, for us to attain success here, particularly as we think about expanding that geography of innovation, it's critical that we think about community colleges as really being sort of front and center with respect to how we're engaging them and where they're being engaged.
Next up, we have a question from Lee Jun about the AI Institute program, looking for a little more detail there, particularly about the project execution plans that might be needed, and whether there's any supplemental support for developing infrastructure for the community.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Lee Jun. Thanks for asking that. So I am actually, because the AI Institutes, they're really meant to be sort of an illustrative example, and they're in the SAIS directorate, as some of you know, I'm going to yield to my SAIS colleagues on that. I don't want to overstep or step on their toes. So I'll yield to my SAIS colleagues on that. I do think, though, that they have the program officer team with the AI Institutes program has worked out quite a bit of detail about the project execution plans, and they also have some thoughts with regard to sort of everything from foundational to use inspired to translational work. So I'm going to punt on that question, because I think it's only fair that I let my SAIS colleagues take the lead on responding to that one.
We have a question from Yu Chen about the sort of proposal matching and the themes that you've talked about. At what stage of the technology development does a proposal need to match the theme and tone of TIP? Would a TIP proposal require a team that consists of members from both academics, the academic side and industry side, for example?
So I mean, I hate to answer the question with an "it depends," but it really does depend, right? It depends on the situation. It depends on the context. I think that we imagine that there might be proposals to the foundation through TIP in particular that have that industry engagement or have a state and local engagement piece to them, but not always the case, right? So I'll take I-Corps, for example, which is a program within the TIP directorate now. So when we think about our I-Corps teams, researcher and entrepreneur and a student, for instance, as part of those teams. When we think about those teams, you might not necessarily have industry as part of your partnership set right at the outset. Instead, you're going through the I-Corps experience specifically because you're thinking about that customer market fitness. Similarly with the POSE program, the Open Source Ecosystems program. So I think part of what we're trying to do is to be able to provide researchers with that initial sort of seedling of investment through TIP that allows folks to be able to start down the path and then progress more fully down the path to technology translation. So I think I hope hope I've communicated to you why the honest answer is it depends. It depends on where you are in the process and with which program within TIP you might be engaging.
Question from Paul Sherratt. For most programs, NSF funds fundamental research, as noted in the intellectual merit section of the proposal. Should projects that are going to TIP have a fundamental component in addition to the applied focus? Will proposals require a stated section on intellectual merit?
Yeah, so great question. So the short answer to that is that we really in TIP are focusing on use-inspired and translational work. So when I think about fundamental research, I think about the spectrum from pure curiosity-driven basic research to much more use-inspired basic research. And as far as the TIP portfolio is concerned, we're more on that use-inspired side and leading into translational research as well. So we're not expecting a foundational component, for example, to the projects that come into TIP. Rather, we expect that some of that would go to our existing directorates, and as it's enhanced, as it matures, then start to progress into TIP. I could also imagine a situation where we're supporting research that spans that spectrum, and it's co-funded by TIP in collaboration with the other directorates. So I hope that answers the question.
We have another question here from Lewis, who asks for you to outline a bit about how TIP will work when there's a project in the domain that might relate to biomedical or health applications. So if NSF is restricted to more fundamental research in life science, while the biomedical and health applications are situated more in NIH, is it possible for NSF to support developing partnerships related, for example, to electronic health records or use of complex network analysis for gene regulation and disease?
Yeah, so great question. Thanks for that question. Let me say that, part of our ambition with the TIP Directorate is to be able to catalyze the partnerships with other agencies that allow us to be able to really walk that entire spectrum that I described. So I'll give you an example actually more on the agriculture side, and then hopefully that'll serve as sort of illustrative for the purposes of the healthcare domain. So in the agriculture space, for instance, we have a long and deep working relationship, effective working relationship with our colleagues at the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, USDA NIFA. And in that collaboration, it is the case that we try to understand what are some of their use cases. How do those use cases help to inspire research that's maybe use-inspired work, right? And then how do we also work with them to help translate that work out into practice? I'll go back to the AI Institutes as an illustrative example again. With the AI Institutes program, USDA NIFA has wholly funded 4 of the 18 institutes that we've supported to date. And so part of what we're looking to do is to build out those relationships with USDA, with DOE, with DOD, with NIH, with HHS more generally, to be able to orchestrate the kinds of work that span the spectrum from fundamental research all the way to trying to have that translational impact. I do think that if we're talking about something that's very disease-focused, human disease-focused, it's going to be much more in the NIH purview. But if we're talking about how that might motivate questions around information technologies, for instance, and care delivery, or social and behavioral questions around care delivery, for instance, those are certainly well within NSF's purview, and we do those often in partnership with NIH. And we have a program, Smart and Connected Health, for instance. It's got a new name now, which I never can remember. But the program really brings NIH and NSF together in trying to support innovations in AI and data science and predictive modeling to help us get to a better understanding of care delivery, and helps both NSF and NIH's mission spaces. So I hope that I answered that question.
And here's a sort of similar related question from Yu Chen, asking for a little bit more delineation about TIP versus what's being done in STTR and SBIR programs.
Yeah, so the SBIR, STTR programs now fall within the TIP Directorate. right? So they're part of our mission space. And so when I think about that, I think about SBIRS TTR as part of that translational pathway from research in a lab to research that can have impact in terms of new startups and small businesses and new market potential and market capitalization. And so when I think about that, I think about SBIRS TTR as part of that portfolio of programs that we look to stand up that allow us to be able to cover that spread in terms of technology translation. By the way, Rachel, if I can maybe use whatever prerogative this might be, and just say, I'm reading in the chat some of the other questions that come up, and one of them talks about how NSF needs to support major universities, regional campuses with MS degrees as well. These universities actually contribute to local economy and applied research more than their main campus, and I fully agree with that sentiment. I think that sentiment, please don't take my comments about community colleges as an indicator that we're moving away from four-year universities. I think this is a real important moment for us to think about how do we bring together resources that can support all different institution types, including major and regional campuses associated with the university as well.
One question that's really coming from me, which is we have many questions from people who would like a copy of your slides. Are you willing to share them with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share a PDF of my slides for folks to be able to look at. No problem.
All right. So folks, when we send you the link to the recording, we will send you a link to the PDF of the slide deck. So let's all settle down about that. Fantastic. Thank you. We have a question from Aidan Livingston who asks, we're a small business who works with universities and industry. How many partnerships should we have lined up for a successful NSF Engines Phase 1 proposal?
So Aidan, I would actually encourage you to direct that question to the webinar tomorrow afternoon that we have on the Engines program. And you're probably not going to get an answer that's going to maybe precisely satisfy you there, right? We're thinking about this from the perspective of we want to bring together an ecosystem, right? This is a significant level of investment, ultimately, $160 million of investment over a 10-year time horizon. We want to really significantly contribute to the economic growth of that particular region. And one thing I should say is, if you look at some of the pending legislation, NSF is charged to come at it from a research-based perspective, and the Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration is charged to stand up regional tech hubs that come at it more from the economic and job creation perspective. And so I think there's a meeting in the middle there where you could imagine multiple regional innovation engines that feed into a given regional tech hub as well. But in terms of how many exactly partnerships do you need, I think that's a bit specific, right? I think that I would encourage you to think about what is the level of engagement that you need across different stakeholders where they actually have meaningful contributions to the effort, and those meaningful contributions collectively rise up to the level of a regional scale innovation ecosystem.
Next, we have a question from Tara Dakal, who asks if you could talk more about the NSF Convergence Accelerator Program and whether solar manufacturing may fall within that program's interests.
Yeah, so that's great. So the Convergence Accelerator is a program that's been around since the fall of 2019. And our goal with that program, as you probably saw on that slide, is really to try to focus in on specific areas of research, right? So open knowledge networks, trying to build out a prototype of an open knowledge network, AI and the future of work, trying to understand how, as we embed AI in different work contexts, how does that affect those work contexts? How do you manifest the human AI interaction that you need in those environments so that you have job growth and not job losses? Thinking about trust and authenticity in our communication systems, thinking about how do we enhance opportunities through technologies specifically for persons with disabilities. So these are very specific topical areas that have bubbled up. And how did we get to those topical areas? We got to those topical areas through a public request for information that we put out every year for the Convergence Accelerator. We get all of your great ideas in terms of, hey, we should see something in this space, or we should see something in that space. We try to aggregate those great ideas, and based off of the directions that the community is encouraging us, us or nudging us, we'll then run a series of workshops, for instance, and that ultimately would lead us to deciding, okay, we're going to focus on this track or these 2 tracks or these 3 tracks for the year ahead. So I can't answer the question whether that particular topic will be a future track, but I'd encourage you to be sure that you're on the lookout for the RFI, for the Convergence Accelerator, and taking part in the workshops to help us understand, in a bottom-up fashion, the spaces that really are well poised for impact and where the community is well poised to engage on that impact.
Next up, question from, I think it might be from someone else, but coming up under Michelle Hayes's name. What are the analogs of the AI Institute that have been planned in your directorate for security and energy?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So a couple of things I would say on that. So one is, remember that we have a number of analogs for AI institutes more generally across the foundation. So there's the Quantum Leap Challenge Institutes. There's investments that we make in future manufacturing. There's investments that we're making in materials research, the DEMREF program that we have at NSF. There's investments that we make in the biotech space, in the bioeconomy space, the biology integration institutes that we support. So in a number of these emerging tech areas, we're seeing investments that we're making through our existing directorates that span that foundational to more use-inspired workflows. I think that you could imagine TIP doing more of that as we look to the future. We certainly have some ideas of what that might look like. I'm a little hesitant to comment on exactly what those are until we get the appropriations levels that we would need to be able to really push forward on some of those. But you could imagine that we have ideas in a range of spaces and in partnership with our existing directorates as well. Having said that, I would just say the topic areas that you've raised, security and energy areas, for instance, I'd encourage you to look at the Innovation Engines program to see if an impact at that scale and scope could be realized in any of those spaces.
And here's one that looks like
one of the things that, sorry, Rachel, just really quickly, one of the things that I'll note is that in the FAQs that accompany the broad agency announcement for the Engines program, the very last FAQ, the very last question asks the question, so can you give me some examples? And I want to stress, those are strictly examples. Sometimes we even debated at some length, should we include any, but we wanted to just to give you a sense for the breadth and depth that we're expecting with an engine. But those are illustrative of some of the topic spaces that one could imagine NSF funding an engine on.
Here's a question that might work well as a point for us to wrap up. Thinking about the TIP and your goals for the new directorate, tell us how you'll define TIP succeeding, 5 years out, 10 years out. What are you hoping will be different because of this initiative?
That's a great question, Rachel. And a great question to end on. So I will say the following, right? When we think about where we are as a country today in terms of key technology areas, there's a lot of talk about how other countries are investing more and more in these areas and how the US is potentially in a worrisome or troublesome spot when it comes to our competitiveness in these areas. And I think that, as I said at the outset, this vision for the TIP Directorate requires resourcing, and it requires all of us working together, and it requires really broad and diverse engagement of stakeholders from all across the country and in all different institution types and all different topic areas. So for me, success, and this is a very meta point, right? And so you might say, oh, that's too high level, but I think that this is a high level that we keep our fingers on and we keep our mind trained on as we think about this. And that is, 5 years from now, is the conversation around global competitiveness for the US in some of these technology areas starting to change. We're not going to overnight, reshore semiconductor production, for example. We're not going to overnight change the narrative in some of these areas. But are we 4 or 5 years from now really starting to see the needle move in terms of the discourse that we're having because of the investments that we're making through TIP and because of the economic and job creation that we're seeing all across the country in these different areas?
With that, thank you, Dr. Bianchandani, for a very comprehensive and very informative presentation, covering not just the TIP Directorate, but also the paradigm shift, as you put it, at NSF at large, with the increased emphasis on translational and market-driven research, social impact, and equity. I think the information you shared would be very useful and very valuable for our researchers and entrepreneurs as they continue to actively participate and leverage opportunities from NSF. Thank you again from all of us. Thank you to Rachel for moderating the event and all of us who joined us today. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Mira. Thanks for having me, and I hope this has been helpful.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.